I was thinking about doing another one of these anyway. After the Corvid video was so well received, I wondered what might be a good next thing to cover. I thought rodents would be an interesting one. While they're not as popular as corvids, they are extremely well studied in modern science. They're used as analogues for humans in a lot of disease models because they're fairly similar to us in the grand scheme of things, but they reproduce much more quickly. But we still share some aspects of early medieval people's relationships with rodents. They come into our houses and they eat our food. Wood mice have recently come into both my dad's and my granddad's houses and did a bit of damage, including eating a quantity of raw potato that I'd guess would be equivalent to about 4 large plates of food for a human. They're known for chewing through wire insulation, and in fact, before we got rid of them, my dad had one chew through his landline, and it's completely normal for mice to eat each other. Even under no stress at all, mother mice will regularly eat their own babies alive for various reasons, from just not knowing how to look after them if they're a new mother, to realising that they have too many to feed and deliberately culling the litter down. As soon as a fellow mouse is dead, even an adult, it's just another source of food. These animals will eat a huge range of things, and that gives them huge pest potential. So how did early medieval people experience and understand these animals? By the way, I know that releasing them into the garden will just cause them to come back in the house. I did eventually release them all in a forest and they haven't come back, but I just wanted to see how they'd get off this platform. Semantic taxonomy isn't as much of a problem in this video as it was in the Corvid one. One word, moose, seems to have represented a very wide range of animals in Old English. Nowadays, in terms of native mice in the UK, we have the house mouse, the wood mouse and the yellow-necked mouse, which are pretty much indistinguishable from each other unless you have a dead one in front of you, the hazel-door mouse and the harvest mouse. Although these do look different on any kind of close inspection, and they do behave differently and live in different environments. You're most likely to see house mice and wood mice in your house. In fact, I think wood mice are actually more common in houses in the UK, although they live all around in nests made of whatever they can find. Harvest mice live in fields and hedges, and they're famously very small and light to the point that they can climb up a stem of wheat without it collapsing. Hazel door mice spend most of their time in trees. It's once again unclear how much the average person would have been aware of these differences. Early medieval people spent a lot of time outdoors and must have had to deal with mice going after their stored food. For many early medieval people it may have been one of the main problems that they had to deal with, but they were only human. Probably some of them noticed more than others. An animal that we think of as a pest nowadays, at least in Britain, is the feral pigeon, which lives in cities. It doesn't occur to a lot of us in Britain that the wood pigeon is a different kind of bird, even though they look obviously different if seen next to each other. They have the same common name in English, and it's not important for most of us to be able to tell the difference. It doesn't hurt us to think of these species as pests all round, even if some of them aren't really pests. As we don't see fine delineation between different mouse species in Old English texts, that may have been the case back then. But even if there were subcategories like wood mouse or tree mouse, these might not have made their way into ecclesiastical texts. What we have is far from a good account of the spoken language. The word moose will be familiar to a lot of people who study Latin, because the classical Latin word for mouse was the same. If there are any differences in pronunciation, maybe a slightly retracted S in Latin, mus versus moose, but easily recognisably the same word. The most obvious explanation might seem to be that one language borrowed it from the other, but these are actually both native words in their respective languages. Old English and Latin both come from a common ancestor language that we call Proto-Indo-European, spoken roughly in what's now Ukraine, about 5,000 years ago. The Old English and Latin words moose are cousins that happen to look very similar to each other, just because they're composed of sounds that haven't changed that much over time. The Bosworth-Toller Dictionary gives a few examples of moose being glossed, translated into Latin by Old English writers. Unsurprisingly, it's often glossed with the Latin word mus, but also with the Latin word sorex. The meaning of sorex could be anything between mouse and shrew. Modern taxonomy doesn't put shrews in the same category as mice. They're related to hedgehogs and moles, which aren't rodents. But of course that means nothing to an Old English speaker. Britain also has 3 native vole species. the bank vole, the field vole and the water vole. We have the common vole, but nowadays that's restricted to islands because it went extinct and was reintroduced on those islands. Voles look a lot like mice, generally more rounded with stouter heads and generally a bit bigger. The best footage I have of voles is of these two bank voles at the British Wildlife Centre, but I think they must be young ones because they look very mousy and small to me. Maybe a rodent expert can elucidate in the comments. References to the moose are often literary devices to try and explain something else. Alfrich's second homily presents an idea about mice that seems surprisingly modern. Aug se Michela ylp, the thermodigan fauras mit alle aufbaut mit his eeslichan nypele. On draat him for thaurle, if he sith an emus, thauch the semus ne mare, his Michel nusse derian. Also, the brave elephant, which beats brave bulls to death with its terrible trunk, is very afraid if it sees a mouse, even though the mouse can't injure its largeness or its greatness. This seems to be an example of how all animals are scared of something, and sometimes the largest animals are scared of the smallest things. It also gives the example of a lion being scared of a white chicken. Of course, lions and elephants didn't exist in England at this point, but there was at least, among educated people, some awareness of them through the Bible and maybe also through people whose professions led to them travelling a lot. I've mentioned in another video that the word ape is a native Germanic word originally meaning monkey, so there's a good chance that a lot of normal people had some level of awareness of non-Western European animals. Anyway, the way this is framed tells us, unsurprisingly, that the writer thought of mice as being the opposite of an elephant. The exact kind of thing you wouldn't expect an elephant to be scared of. Maybe very small, very weak, pathetic. This is maybe no new interesting information because all of those characteristics of mice seem pretty obvious to us, but at least it's a little confirmation that we have some basic opinions of mice in common with at least one early medieval writer. Another slightly more perplexing mouse line is highlighted in Claudia Claridge's article on exaggeration in Old English manuscripts. In the letter of Alexander to Aristotle, translated probably in the 900s, we find the line Thar thar quam auk indische mus, in thafur in foxae lichnisse, and in heura michle. Then there also came Indian mice into the army, in the likeness of foxes and in their size. Claridge points out that this may not simply be an exaggeration about actual mice the size of foxes, because it says that the mice look like foxes and are also the size of foxes. So maybe it's just a way of describing a different species. For the record, capybaras don't live in India and didn't back then either. As far as I know, all living and fossil species of capybara live in the Americas, so it wasn't them. Beavers lived in England back then, so probably wouldn't have seemed exotic to the writer, and there aren't any other rodent species that are anywhere near the size of a fox. This is probably always just going to be one of those passages that's difficult to explain. From an experiential angle, I've volunteered in a reconstructed early medieval house at Butser Ancient Farm in Hampshire. Of course that's in modern England, so it's not quite the same ecologically, but it's perhaps another avenue of understanding how mice behave in this context. And as you might expect, mice were basically impossible to keep out of the actual house. Interestingly, a barn owl was also present around the house. From the leavings you could tell that it had been sitting on the ventilation hole at the end of the roof, and as owls do, it sometimes deposited pellets that had rodent bones in them. So in that way, mouse and vole populations were probably kept under control naturally. We don't know whether or not people used any kind of mouse traps, but there are plenty of simple ways of trapping mice that people back then could easily have made in theory. As I said, it seems like shrews may have sometimes fallen under the moose term. Shrews are insectivores related to moles, and as I said, not rodents, and their diets are much more restricted to small animals, and as a result they're not as much of a pest to humans. I only remember seeing maybe 2 shrews in my life, both dead in the middle of paths through the woods. I took some pictures of one of them. Look away for the next few seconds if you don't want to see a dead shrew. I'm sure anybody who's spent a lot of time outside, especially someone who worked in hazel coppicing or something like that, would see shrews more often than I have, although they do look like mice from a distance and their basic behaviour of scuttling off when they feel threatened would certainly add to the impression that they were the same thing as mice. They're very aggressive, their bites are painful and slightly venomous, and they're so often found dead in paths that some have speculated that they just have heart attacks when anything even slightly stressful happens. I'm not sure whether research stands on that, but they certainly have very short lifespans and very fast metabolisms. But there is another Old English word relevant here. Shrawa. This is the ancestor of the shrew word in modern English. The Bosworth-Toller Old English Dictionary translates it as shrew mouse, but that's a dictionary created by Victorian authors, and so it's important to check with the early medieval sources. Indeed, Bosworth-Toller gives a couple of examples where writers have glossed this word in Latin with, apologies Luke Ranieri, hang on, let's try this, musaranius, which is meant to mean shrew in Latin, so the evidence does converge on shrew perhaps being its own category in Old English, at least sometimes. What about larger, more pesty rodents? Rat. I don't think I have to explain which modern English word this became, but as this is another pest animal, it makes sense that Old English speakers would be sensitive to the difference between these and mice. Britain has brown rats and black rats, although having got a load of footage of this brown rat and got really excited that I could put it in the video, I discovered that they didn't exist in Europe yet while Old English was spoken, probably having trickled over from Asia in the post-medieval period. Black rats almost certainly did exist here at that point. A 2022 paper suggested that the black rat had been introduced to Europe in several separate events between the Roman and medieval periods. It seems like rats became a lot less common in Europe around the start of the medieval period in the 500s AD, and then their population picked back up over the course of the period. So despite the image we might have of medieval people's houses being full of rats and things, there may have been large swathes of the period in England for which that wasn't the case, and actually mice were the biggest problem. And of course both rats and mice eat agricultural crops, and it must have been extremely important to prevent them doing that. Unfortunately, a lot of rodent management techniques are unlikely to leave archaeological evidence. There's some evidence of hayricks from early medieval sites. The structure of those hayricks isn't exactly clear, so we're not sure to what extent they were mouse-proof, but that is a way that farmers often protect at least animal fodder from rodents, putting it on a raised platform that's designed to be difficult for rodents to get onto. Another way of doing it that wouldn't leave archaeological evidence would be to just let some kind of domestic predatory animal wander around and keep the population under control. I'll focus on predators in another video at some point, but early medieval people in England certainly had domestic cats. Mustelids like stoats and weasels can be used for pest control, but I don't personally know of any specific evidence of this from this period. But plenty of mustelid species do live in Britain and did back then, and remains of them are found associated with human settlements, so it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch that they may have been helping to control rodent populations, whether the humans owned the mustelids or whether they were just wild mustelids that were taking advantage of the rodent problem. What about more exotic types of rodent? Arquerna. A few Germanic languages have a word that looks like it should translate to English acorn, but actually translates to English squirrel. Old English is no exception. The deeper etymology of the word isn't clear. It goes back to something like Eiquerna in proto-Germanic, and the wer part seems to have evolved from an older word for squirrel, but it's not clear whether the eik part of the word refers to oak trees which squirrels frequent, or some other root implying a sort of quivering or skittish animal. Nowadays, grey squirrels are the most common in Britain, but they were only introduced from North America in the 1870s, and before that the only species of squirrel or squirrel-like thing in Britain was the red squirrel. Red squirrels look a bit different to grey squirrels, but behave broadly similarly. Before the introduction of grey squirrels, of course, they were a lot more common. I can't find a lot written about squirrels from the period, and I don't want to just rattle off facts about them, so I tried to think of ways in which they may have been relevant to human life. Having helped on a hazel coppice before, I did wonder about their impact on the hazel industry. Hazel is a flexible wood used for building wattle, which is kind of interwoven wicker panels that can be used as fencing or as a skeleton for the wall of a building. Hazel can also be used for various other things. It's grown on nowadays roughly 7-year cycles. After 7 years, the trees are generally optimally tall and thin to create wattle from. And this was a very important industry in the early medieval period. Red squirrels eat hazelnuts, but also take them and cache them for future use, and because their spatial memory isn't as good as it could be, they often forget caches, meaning the nuts have an opportunity to grow into a new tree. So there's this symbiosis whereby the squirrels get food, and in return the trees get planted. I suppose whether or not squirrels were seen as a pest might depend on the strategies medieval coppices used to plant new trees. On a modern coppice at least, hazel stalls last decades. These are effectively the stumps of hazel that new hazel rods grow out of, and while the rods get cut every few years, the stall stays alive and produces new hazel rods. So you don't necessarily need a large volume of new trees all the time. The bigger problem here is large herbivores destroying all the saplings in the early part of the growth cycle, so things like deer might have been a bigger problem than squirrels on an infrastructural level at least. Although of course hazelnuts aren't just useful for planting new hazel, they're also edible to humans and they make good fodder for goats and pigs as well. So maybe there is reason to think that certain people in early medieval society might not have liked red squirrels as much as we do now. Anybody with an even slight understanding of ecology might correct my uneducated speculation there, and of course this isn't me slamming red squirrels. Grey squirrels would have done the same damage, probably just worse. Beaver. Another more exotic rodent is the beaver. They went extinct in Britain in the middle of the last millennium and have only been reintroduced recently, but of course in the early medieval period they were still natively present in Britain. There are a few attested spellings of the Old English word. These might look just a bit off to a modern English speaker. Surely the vowel should be long. But the modern long vowel is the result of open syllable lengthening, which happened in the early Middle English period between the 1100s and 1300s. The word beaver, or the ancestral forms of this word, have probably had the same meaning for a very long time. And that's because in Latin you find a cognate of the word beaver, not a word that's been borrowed from Latin into English or from English to Latin, but a word that's been inherited from the ancient common ancestor of the two languages. That Latin word is fiber. My usual apologies to Luke. And you'd be forgiven for thinking that it was the same word with the order of the sounds changed a bit, but this is actually the result of regular sound changes being applied to a Proto-Indo-European form, something like bebrus. I'm bad at pronouncing voiced aspirates, so sorry if I've got that wrong there. In both Latin and English, the b sound developed differently depending on if it was at the start or in the middle of the word. Beavers are large rodents that live on rivers, and they block up water channels by building dams made of wood and other miscellaneous things they can find. Sometimes this involves completely felling trees by gnawing through the trunk to get wood for dam building material. By building these dams, they force water to be redirected beyond the normal river channel that it would go down, and that causes areas of land to become waterlogged. This creates dynamic habitats for all kinds of animals, and it's now seen as an important contribution to ecosystems that beavers inhabit, but if you're a human trying to live nearby, it can be very disruptive. Trees you might use for building material yourself could be felled by beavers, and maybe more problematically, areas of land that you'd allocated to certain things could randomly become wetlands, unsuitable for the thing you wanted to do with them. That was one reason why people may well want beavers out of their local area. Another pressure on beavers is that their fur is valuable and seems to have been valuable in Europe at the time, so there's all sorts of reasons why beavers might have been under threat from humans in a given area. Finally, because there isn't enough on them to justify a whole separate video, I'll talk about one last species that aren't rodents. This word has a few forms. Iel or eel, or sometimes that's collapsed to just eel. Nowadays, most people call them hedgehogs, although the older root has survived in German Igel and other West Germanic roots as well, and also in North Germanic where its meaning has shifted to something like sea urchin, although the Proto-Germanic word is likely to have meant hedgehog. These are prickly insectivores that live in hedges and under piles of leaf litter, and as they live in modern gardens, they may well have lived in early medieval settlements, at least at the margins. A couple of Latin glosses reveal the identity of this animal, although it's so clearly a cognate of other West Germanic words for hedgehog that it might have been obvious anyway. Interestingly, but not surprisingly, some glosses have the Latin istrix, meaning porcupine, translated as semara iel, the larger hedgehog. Porcupines don't live in Britain and are actually rodents rather than hedgehogs, so it might be that this was just a kind of English, almost academic term for them, seen in ecclesiastical texts and not as much in normal speech. We also see hedgehogs being used in similes. Someone's described as being as full of arrows as a hedgehog is with bristles. Another description Bosworth Toller has from Gregory's Pastoral Care is given in Old English and in Latin, but not in Modern English, so I had no Modern English translation to check whether I'd made any mistakes, so apologies if I have. But Se il tham he fangan werde, mon mai seon eider je his fet je his halvold, ac sona swa hine mon je fecht, swa je wint he to anum kliwene, an teeth his fet swa he in mest mai, and he hut his halvod. The hedgehog, before it's going to be caught, one is able to see its feet or its head, but as soon as you catch it, it sort of turns into a ball and takes its feet as far in as it can and hides its head. A few words there I wasn't sure about and sort of had to fill in from context, so sorry if any nuance has been missed. So in that little Old English passage, we have a writer from the time telling you something that a modern English writer might also have told you, but it's always nice to hear those things coming from such a long time ago. To finish off the video, here are some of the cognate words in other Germanic languages. Sometimes there's not an attested word as far as I can find, although in a lot of cases there does seem to be a modern word, for example in modern Frisian or modern Dutch, suggesting that there probably was an Old Frisian or Old Dutch word that just potentially wasn't written down. Sorry for that skip in speech there. So it may have been that there was a word in the spoken language that just didn't get written down. I've put Gothic as a branch on this tree, but I don't think any of the words I'm about to say are attested in Gothic as far as I know, probably just because Gothic has a more limited corpus than the other languages. The word for mouse is very similar across these languages, possibly having a more retracted S in proto-Germanic, mus, and a less retracted S in Old English, moose. The word Eiquerno in proto-Germanic gives Arquerna in Old English, something like Eichhorno in Old High German, and Ichkorni in Old Norse. Bevrus in proto-Germanic gives Bever in Old English, along with the variants that I said earlier, Bibar in Old High German, and Bjor in Old Norse. And finally, Igilas in proto-Germanic gives Il and all the variants in Old English, something like Igel, I guess that would be pronounced in Old Frisian, Igil in Old High German, and Igul in Old Norse. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.